All right, here we are again, continuing our series of videos on great ideas in psychology. This is part 16 in the series based on a book with the same title by Professor Fatali Muqaddam. Let me begin with sharing my screen. So chapter 16 of the book is about obedience to authority, obedience to authority. And this is our place in the general plan of the book, general plan of our presentations. After this, we will turn to feminist psychology, and we have, including this part, we have 5 presentations to go to finish the series. Let me begin this part with a demonstration or a research report from 1970s. I think the paper was published in 1974. The research was conducted and reported by Dr. Leonard Bickman, and it was a simple study. The design was quite simple and elegant. It was later referred to in terms of the power of the uniform. So what did they do? They stopped people on the street and gave them a simple command, a random command. So the random means it didn't have any apparent reason behind it. So for example, hey, give $1 or a dime to this homeless person there, or move away from the bus stop. So just imagine giving people on the street, or receiving, as one of those people on the streets, receiving a random order from a stranger. Would you follow that order? Would you obey that command or not? Now, the so-called independent variable, what the researchers manipulated, was what the person giving the command was wearing. So the order comes from someone either in uniform or somebody who is dressed as a civilian. So uniform could be, let's say, a fireman, a guard, or even a milkman. The finding was that when the person giving the command is wearing the uniform, they receive a higher rate of compliance from people, even if it is a milkman uniform. Why? Well, the uniform, we can say, uniform symbolizes or is associated with some kind of authority, some kind of power, some kind of responsibility. And when we detect that the person we are encountering has that authority, has some kind of responsibility, maybe we want to cooperate with them. Maybe the milkman himself doesn't have power, but he represents an organization that has power, that does something at a large scale. So because of that, because of the representative status of the person in the uniform, because they are more than just a person, they are representative of an organization, and the organization is large and has responsibilities and pursues larger aims or larger goals, we are probably more likely to comply with the request of a person in uniform. Of course, a guard uniform is more effective than a milkman uniform, but the very fact that the person is wearing a uniform makes a difference. Okay, now, after that relatively specific demonstration, that study, let's talk about the general concept of obedience. Obedience consists of changes in behavior that arise when people follow the instructions of persons in authority. Okay, you already knew this. We already have an understanding of this concept of obedience, but this is how our author talks about it. The larger context of this quote is obedience. It says, obedience cements and regulates social relationships, and in this respect serves a function similar to conformity. Remember, conformity was our topic in the previous video. But unlike conformity, obedience is more explicitly associated with major tragedies in human societies, in human history, such as acts of genocide and atrocities committed by different groups of people. We are now contrasting conformity and obedience. There are important differences between these two types of phenomenon. Our author lists 4 of these differences. In the case of obedience, we have a hierarchy. Somebody is higher in status than the other person, and because they are higher, they can issue command. The second difference is in terms of explicitness of the order. In the case of obedience, we have somebody giving a direct, explicit order to another person. In the case of conformity, we don't need to have an explicit suggestion. People just watch each other and they just copy and conform. So that's number 3. Imitation is something that happens in the case of conformity, not obedience. And a sense of choice, and that the sense that what you're doing is a voluntary action. You're choosing it on a voluntary basis. That is something that happens more, it is present more in the case of conformity and less in the case of obedience. People who follow orders feel less in control. In extreme cases of obedience, we can refer to the extreme cases as blind obedience. What is blind obedience? It is when somebody is simply following orders regardless of the consequence of those orders for others and even for oneself. What are we doing when we blindly obey orders? We are denying certain things. We are neglecting and denying. Maybe we are acting in denial. What are we denying? We are denying our own ability, our own capacity to think, to judge, to make decisions. We are, in a sense, denying our own agency when we are engaged in blind obedience. We have, with the capacity to think, you can argue, because you're capable of thinking, you have a duty to think. You have a right to think and use your own thinking process as a basis for your own judgment. But of course, we are also capable of blind obedience. Great thinkers in the past, including one of them, Cicero, the Roman statesman and philosopher, Marcus Tullius Cicero, he was concerned with the potential impact of obedience to a charismatic authority for political systems. So he argued in favor of designing a political system that controlled the power of a charismatic leader. So for example, the president, the idea of keeping the executive power in check, especially in the case of highly popular presidents, was something that the founding fathers of the US also had in mind, influenced by Cicero's ideas. Of course, Cicero is right. He's pointing out something really important. But in our time, we have even more reasons to be concerned and be alarmed, more reasons to be alarmed about the problems of obedience, blind obedience. Why? Because there has been a shift in the spirit of times. So historically, what was emphasized more was duties. It was the duties of subordinates that were given priority. For example, within the family, women and children were expected to show unquestioning obedience to the man, the so-called man of the house. And beyond the family, in the larger context, individuals were expected to show unquestioning obedience to the monarch, the king or queen, the head of the church, and their local representatives. But this was followed, this kind of traditional view in maybe classical societies, was followed by a series of critical events, a series of critical turning points in history of political organization. And what happened, if you put all these critical events together and summarize their impact, we could say that these series of critical events shifted the emphasis from duties of citizens, duties of individuals, to their rights. So now people pay attention to, in addition to, maybe, or instead of their duties, they pay attention to their rights as a consequence of those turning points. So a right is a demand that you place on others. You have the rights. You can demand based on your right as a human being. Now, within this context, it is alarming that we still see a response to charismatic leaders in the form of obedience or blind obedience. We can ask now, but why do we still see instances where a large group follows a charismatic leader regardless of the ethical commitments of that leader? Associated with this question is the question of responsibility. When there is a charismatic leader and when there is blind obedience or strong tendency to obey, who is responsible? Is the leader responsible? Is the whole organization responsible? Or are the actors who follow the orders responsible, or all of them? I'm going to review a recent study that addresses these questions. But in psychology, there is one name that is most strongly associated with obedience to authority, and that is Stanley Milgram. Stanley Milgram studied for a time with Solomon Asch, who we referred to in the previous part on conformity. He was working in Solomon Asch's laboratory, and he was thinking about the social consequence of offloading your thinking and making decision based on factors outside of you. So Milgram designed this famous experiment that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, but let's just go through it, the basic elements of the design. So in Milgram's experiment, there is one subject. There's one person who is really being studied. And here is a person in the middle who is described as the subject. The official title of this subject within the experiment, they are called a teacher, and they are supposed to take the role of a teacher. And the person on the left side, who is a fake subject, they are supposed to take the role of a student. The teacher is supposed to ask the meaning of some words, and the student is supposed to give the meaning of those words, something like that. The experimenter is sitting there to give instructions and to make sure that the experiment is remaining on course, and urges the participant to keep going. What is the task? The task of the main participant, the main research subject, who is also called, as I just said, the teacher. The task of the teacher or the research participant was to instruct the students, but also to administer punishment at an increased voltage level each time the student gave an incorrect answer. Is there some documents, some photos from the original experiment? The machine that was supposed to give the shocks, the shock generator, its intensity varied from 0 to 450 volts in increments of 15 volts. And there were clear labels for each level of shock, beginning with slight shock, moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intense shock, danger, and danger, severe shock. And finally, there was the final level that was marked with XXX, which is a kind of translinguistic way of signaling danger. To cut the story short, what Milgram reported was that about 65% of the participants were fully obedient, meaning that they continued to give shocks to the other person, the so-called student, until they reached the highest voltage level, marked as XXX. Of course, this was stressful for many of them. Many of them hesitated, but the experimenter urged them to continue. Many of them had reservations about continuing. Maybe some of them figured out what the experiment was about. Maybe they figured out that the shock was not real, but we don't want to talk about all those details. The experiment was later replicated with female participants, so it is not limited to, it's not a finding that is only applied to male participants. And it was also replicated in other countries outside of the US. And the finding is that between 40% to 90% of people obey the command of the experimenter. Okay, there are many commentaries, many interpretations and reinterpretations of Milgram's original findings. And I will refer you at the end of this presentation to two books. But before doing that, I want to talk about a recent extension. This is a study that I think is quite important, published in PLOS ONE. It's an open access journal. The article is open access. You can read it. And if you are interested in this topic, I would encourage you to read this. It's a study written by Emily Casper and two co-authors. What Casper and colleagues did was essentially to divide the person into two parts. So you could either have one person who could choose to give a shock and then execute that shock, or you can have two people. One person decides to give a shock and the other person follows the decision of the commander. Now, what do they find? Very briefly, this is just one of their figures in the study. I think this is the more important figure. On the left side, you have the frequency of deciding to shock. So if you are the person who is both deciding to shock and giving the shock, that's the agent free choice condition. In that condition, you are giving a relatively fewer number of shocks, administering a fewer number of shocks compared to when there's a division of labor. The commander, who is not themselves giving the shock, chooses to give a larger number of shocks, because they feel less responsible over the action. So that's the second part. On the right side of the figure, we have the responsibility rating. How much do these people feel responsible over the act of shocking someone? So on the left bar, you have the left bar represents the person who is doing both parts of the action, both deciding to give a shock and executing that decision. So they feel relatively more in charge of that action, the totality of that action. The two bars on the right side represent the agent who is being, quote unquote, coerced, following the commands. That person is feeling least responsible. They are feeling least in control. But the commander who is giving the command, who is issuing the command, making the decision to give the shock, that person is also feeling, compared to the agent who is doing everything, that commander is also feeling less in charge, less responsible over the whole action. So just like how the person following the order is saying, I'm just following orders, the person who is giving the order can also say, I am just giving the orders. And what Casper and colleagues are demonstrating is when you divide the action into different parts, the sense of duty, the sense of responsibility, or the sense of being in control, being the agent of the action, is reduced in both agents who are together deciding and enacting that decision. Okay, we can think about the implications of these studies, and if you have any ideas, let me know. I'll end this part by bringing to your attention two books that are giving a critical treatment of the Milgram experiment. One is by Gina Perry, the other one is by Stephen Gibson. They both invite us to pay attention again to the Milgram experiment within a different framework, within a more critical framework, more social framework. Gina Perry specifically talks about some conditions in the original study that were systematically excluded and not reported by Milgram because they didn't fit within his general story. It didn't fit his strong claim about obedience to authority. And Stephen Gibson reinterprets the experiments within the framework of discursive psychology, discursive analysis, or a rhetorical perspective. All right, in the next part, we will turn to feminist psychology. Again, if you have any thoughts, feedback, comments, questions, let me know. And otherwise, I will speak with you in the future parts. Thank you very much. Until then.